Okay, so we've talked about nouns. We know what nouns are. They name people, places, and things. We learned about common nouns that name general people, places, and things. And we learned about proper nouns, which have to be capitalized and they name specific people. So now it's time to talk about pronouns. Um, Pronouns are super important. However, they are not simply nouns that have left the amateur world and decided to go pro, even though that's what it sounds like. But they are important enough that you might want to consider them heroes. Let me explain to you why. Maybe. Here we go. So, pronouns take the place of nouns, repeating ourselves all the livelong day. Check out this paragraph. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert went to the movies. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert like to watch movies. Mrs. Mays got a ticket for Mrs. Mays, and then Mrs. Mays bought Mrs. Mays some popcorn. Mrs. Mays paid with a credit card. Miss Gilbert bought Miss Gilbert some Sour Patch Kids and a Coke. Miss Gilbert paid with cash. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert sat on the fifth row in the theater. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert liked the movie. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert laughed at the movie. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert cleaned up Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert's trash when the movie was over. What a horrible paragraph. I stopped listening and I was the one reading it. Let's fix this. This is where pronouns are the superheroes that come in and save the day, or at least save the paragraph. Let me show you what I mean. So instead of saying Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert went to the movies, we have to leave Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert in that first sentence because we need to know who we're talking about. But I don't have to say their name again. Now I can say they. They is the pronoun that takes the place or refers to Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert. So Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert went to the movies. They like to watch movies. Now I'm talking about one person, so I can't say they. They means more than one. So Mrs. Mays got a ticket. Before I said Mrs. Mays got a ticket, excuse me, for Mrs. Mays. Silliness. Mrs. Mays got a ticket for herself. Herself is the pronoun that refers back to Mrs. Mays. So Mrs. Mays got a ticket for herself, and then she, who? We're still talking about Miss Mays. She refers to Mrs. Mays. She bought some popcorn. She is the pronoun, still refers to Mrs. Mays. She paid with a credit card. So I can't say she anymore. I have to introduce that person again before I can use a pronoun. So the next noun, and it's a proper noun, that we use is Ms. Gilbert. Miss Gilbert bought some Sour Patch Kids and a Coke. She, well, now this she pays to it pays. She refers to the last noun that was used, the last person that was used. So she refers to Miss Gilbert. She paid with cash. They, paragraph, are Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert. So they is the pronoun that takes the place of or refers to Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert. They sat on the fifth row in the theater. They, still referring to Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert, liked the movie. They, Miss Mays and Miss Gilbert, laughed at it. It can't refer to people. It is a thing. What's the last thing we mentioned? The last thing we mentioned was movie. So they laughed at the movie, but it takes the place of movie. Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert cleaned up their trash. There is a pronoun. It shows that more than one person. That's the they part. And the end of that makes it possessive. So it's the trash that belongs to Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert. So there refers to Mrs. Mays and Miss Gilbert. Miss Mays and Miss Gilbert cleaned up their trash when it still refers to the movie, was over. Isn't that a much nicer paragraph than all the Mrs. Mays and Mrs. Gilberts in the last paragraph? Completely. Let me show you what I need you to do now. Okay. In the pronoun section, it comes right after your common and proper noun section. I've written some sentences. Let me show you in a better way. Hang on. This works better. This is how you will see it. So I've written a sentences. Susan walked to the park. She enjoyed jumping on the trampoline. Okay, so I've included some of the words from the sentence here. Which of these words is the pronoun? Remember, pronoun takes the place of a noun. So in this first sentence, Susan walked to the park. There are no pronouns. I'm looking for words like he, she, his, hers, it, they, we, us, me, I, you, your. Those are all pronouns that take the place of other proper nouns. So there's no pronoun in this first sentence, but the second sentence, she enjoyed jumping on the trampoline. She is a pronoun. Okay? And then it says, what does the pronoun refer to? Well, in this sentence, she refers back to the person in the first sentence. Who is the person in the first sentence? Susan. So what is the pronoun? I clicked under the word she. What does the pronoun refer to? I clicked under the word Susan. And I just gave you 2 answers. So that was a free 8 points for you right there. You're going to do the same thing with these next few sentences. This one, Michael shot the basketball. He saw it go through the net. Be careful because there are 2 pronouns that refer to 2 different nouns. It says, what is the first pronoun in the sentence? And what does the first pronoun refer to? And then it gives you the same sentences again and says, what is the second pronoun in the sentence? What does the second pronoun refer to? Okay? So I need you to go now and show me what you know about pronouns, and we'll be done. All right. If you need any help, let me know. I'm right here.